Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fahmida Suleman, and I'm the curator of the Islamic World Collections at the Royal Ontario Museum. I'm also the lead curator of our current exhibition, Unmasking the Pandemic, From Personal Protection to Personal Expression, which is now on until March 27th, 2022. I'm delighted you could join us for today's curator conversation, a digital program that explores themes and subjects from ROM collections alongside industry professionals. I would like to take this opportunity to thank TD Bank for their ongoing support of this program. I'd like to begin with our Canadian land acknowledgement, that the ROM sits on what has been the ancestral lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation since time immemorial to today. I would like to welcome the speakers for today's program, Beyond the Mask, Contemporary Canadian Art During COVID, and I invite them to turn on their cameras. First, I would like to introduce my wonderful colleague at the ROM, Dr. Wen-chien Cheng. She is the Senior Curator and the Louise Hawley Stone Chair of Chinese Arts. Wen-chien is also an affiliated faculty in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto, and she specializes in Chinese painting. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest today, the Ottawa-based multimedia artist, Don Kwan. Don is a third-generation Chinese-Canadian artist whose compelling artworks are grounded in conversations around identity, representation, and intergenerational memory making in the diaspora. I would like to welcome Wen-chien and Don to the program, and will hand off to them now for a short discussion on his work. During the program, please submit your thoughts via the Q&A feature on the screen, and we will have some time at the end to answer your questions. Wen-chien, as you start sharing your screen, I'll just say a few words about the exhibition and how Don's artwork features in it. So this is, for those of you who can make it, this is the live exhibition at the Royal Ontario Museum. We've just had an extension on the opening, the duration. It's now on until March 2022. It's an absolute labor of love. It's curated by three of us. There's myself, Alexandra Palmer, and Sarah Fee. And during the lockdown in 2020, we began collecting COVID masks from around the world. We've collected over 300 masks for the Royal Ontario Museum, and we have managed to display 100 of them in this exhibition. The exhibition is totally free of charge. You don't even need to book to come to the museum. You can just walk in with your mask when the museum's open. The beautiful mask on the left, I'm not going to reveal too much because we are going to be talking about it now, but this is Don's mask, Veneration for Mother and Father, which was a very special acquisition for us for this exhibition. It's made of a paper called joss paper, sometimes called spirit money, and we'll go into what all of that means. But for us, it was a very sensitive and an extremely creative way of engaging with the theme of loss. And we felt that was very important for the exhibition. There are moments of pure joy and happiness and creativity and resilience in the exhibition, but we always keep in mind that the pandemic has caused a lot of loss in our lives, whether it's loss of freedom, of travel, of seeing our loved ones, loss of employment and income, but also loss of our loved ones. So that's all I'm going to say right now. And I'm going to hand over now to Wen-chien.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to join us. Thanks, Fahmida, for your introductions. And also I want to welcome Don to this conversations. So on the screen, as Fahmida already mentioned, that Don's artwork, the veneration for mother and the father mask, is on display. To me personally, I think it's a very powerful artwork that has many layers of the meanings, particularly coming from a third generation Chinese Canadian artist like Don. So before we start to talk about this mask, I would like to invite Don to tell our audience briefly about you, you and your family's background.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks for inviting me to this talk and including me in your collection. I think both my parents would be very honored to know that this piece is in your collection. So I'm a third generation Chinese Canadian queer visual artist. I'm the youngest of 8 siblings. My grandfather arrived here in Canada. It'll be 100 years next year in November, around this time, that we arrived in Canada and settled here. I went to art school, art college, and then after that, my parents, the restaurant that they owned and operated in for about 50 years, my father, which was the patriarch, had a stroke. So I had decided to leave art school, put my art career on hold to kind of help the family business get back on track. Not knowing that I would be there for about 25, 30 years. And then fast forward later to, 30 years later, my siblings and I, not all 8 of us, but, a large majority of us had did the same. So we had paused our careers to kind of help the family business get back on track. And then through that process, we learned so much and so many experiences, building community and also learning about ourselves. A lot of our personalities kind of grew out of that experience. And, the restaurant became something different, more of a creative hub that kind of featured our personalities. Myself as a visual artist, my other brother is also a queer performance artist. So a lot of the restaurant kind of drew that out of us.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that on the screen, this is the photo you provided to me. So on the right, is that your father's restaurant?
Yeah, so that's my father in the bow tie with the waiter at the time, Ken. Yeah, Alan. And he's standing beside Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau at the time with his family, Margaret. And, my dad was really, he had different experiences. His father, he helped his father come to Canada, and he was a community builder in his own right. So his experiences as a Chinese Canadian were different from mine.
Yeah.
So when the Prime Minister started dining at the restaurant, my father was really just overwhelmed, and he felt like he was so Canadian, embraced by the country.
Yes, you can see from the photo, that's a big smile on him, right? So we'll talk about this identity expression representation in your artwork. But first, let's get back to the mask. I guess we're kind of excited that this is exhibited in our current masking the pandemic. To me, this is really sort of artistically very interesting and beautiful, especially that you see the very innovative design. We actually put this mask in a section of the innovation because it's basically a double mask connected with this thread behind. So it draws my immediate sort of attention also because it's made of the Joe's money paper, which Fahmida already mentioned. also printed with this kind of photographic image of your parents. So for someone like me, also has a Chinese background, it would immediately remind me of this implication of the Joe's paper, which is the money for the death. And also from the eye of the Chinese curator, this image, photograph the image of your parents, also reminded me of the Chinese ancestor portraits, which is like the one I'm showing on the screen. These are from the Round collections. This type of the painted ancestor portraits mainly made between 17th to late 19th centuries. So during the the birthday and the death anniversary of your deceased family, you would take them out, hanging on the wall. In front, it was set up a table like this to sort of pay respect to your deceased family member. So this type of ceremony has a very enduring kind of tradition in China. Even today, in a lot of the Chinese community, people still perform this type of the ceremony. But instead of the painted portraits, people now use photographed kind of portrait, like the one Don incorporated in his mask. I actually noticed that you have other works. Oops, this keyboard not very easy to handle. And you have other artworks also articulate this kind of photographic portraiture of your parents. So I'm very curious that when you create these works, do you think, are you thinking of this tradition? How does this work and your veneration mask speak to this tradition?
Yeah, a lot of this piece speaks to those rituals and ceremonies that were taught to me, not by just my parents, but my grandparents and the greater Chinese community at the time. The Chinatown community, like where my parents basically raised us, was very small in Ottawa and very tight-knit. Mm-hmm. So we spent a lot of time as kids, surrounded by elders. And one of my first, creative memories is watching those elders and my parents, paint with a brush, Chinese writing. So mm-hmm. we were steeped in all sorts of traditions and rituals, and Hansan, which is, in my dialect, it's Qingming. It's like the ancestral worship. Yes. Hansan translates to, like climbing to the mountain or climbing the hill. And ancestors are buried usually higher because it gives you a sense that they're, you're honoring them on a higher ground. Mm-hmm. So both my parents passed away just prior to COVID, and I was dealing a lot with their loss, obviously, putting my art career on hold to help the family business. Family obviously means a lot to me. So mm-hmm. their loss was like really deeply felt, not just by me, but like a lot of my family and the surrounding community, that they kind of had a big impact on a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So this piece was very meaningful for me. It was a way for me to kind of communicate to them the period that we're living amongst, like with COVID mm-hmm. and all the anti-Asian hate that came about, and all the struggles and pain and loss that not just I was dealing with, but like watching mm-hmm. go through all this. This piece was kind of a way to, send them a message in my own way mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. of what was happening.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I also want to bring attention to our audience that speaking of the pandemic and the mask, not only you made that one particular mask we exhibited, You actually have several more. Unfortunately, we won't be able to exhibit all of them. I wish we could. For example, the ones on the screen, I found it exciting, very interesting. These two are made actually with the Chinese takeout menus, right? And this is a global mask. And there's a third one. We'll get into that in a minute. I just want to show you. This is made out of a takeout Chinese bag, restaurant bag. So when I saw this mask, I'm just cannot help to think about when we experienced the pandemic in March 2020. We immediately have this lockdown and all the restaurants were closed. And then slowly we have the sort of takeout deliver availables, right? And then also this, you made this mask out of this materials one would typically find it in a Chinese restaurant. So I cannot help to think about what was happening around the time, like anti-Asia sentiments or actions, etc. So I'm just wondering, what's your messages here? Is this pandemic actually pushing you even further as a Chinese Canadian artist to think about using your artwork to mark the history? So yeah, what's your thought behind all this menu, Chinese menu, kind of a restaurant menu mask?
Yep. So prior to COVID, prior to March 15th, that weekend, I was working on a series called Invisible Identities. And it was a series I was working on for about 2-ish years on and off. I don't live I'm based out of Ottawa, but I don't live primarily in Ottawa anymore. I live outside, like about 150 kilometers outside of Ottawa with a studio. And so I was leaving the downtown core, the safety of downtown, the familiarity of it, and it kind of exploring the rural areas. So I started collecting menus from different Chinese Canadian restaurants that I would find in little towns, like in the outskirts of the Ottawa area. And I started making a series of sculptures made out of Chinese menus that resembled the uniforms and the outfits that were typically worn by waiters in, early Chinese Canadian restaurants. So like a bow tie, a dress shirt, aprons. So I had a lot of that material in my studio. And then March 13th was Friday. And, the restaurant, I was working that evening and we had an event and it was on the news that everything was going to be locked down. And, from a full reservation book of clients coming into the restaurant, one by one towards the end of the night, everyone was canceling. So there was a lot of unknown at the time. So the next day, that weekend, I was really struggling, with the loss of the restaurant closing, the loss of my parents, compounded with, listening to all the news over and over again about, what was happening in China, what was happening in the States, in Europe. Everything was really overwhelming. So then that weekend, I was reminded of resilience and what resiliency means. As a queer Chinese Canadian, I was reminded of, all those queer groups that really paved the way for where I am today, with the advocacy, Pink Triangle, living through the stigma of the AIDS pandemic, the AIDS crisis. And then I was also reminded of my parents and my grandfather and my ancestors that, traveled across oceans as children, basically. My grandfather arrived in Canada when he was 11 years old. So those memories all came back to me, and it reminded me of what the power of resilience means. And it put a lot of that weekend into perspective. So from losing all my creativity and energy, I really was reminded of all the strength. And then I started going back into my studio and just puttering around, and I made my first pandemic mask on the 15th. And then I posted it on the 17th, because I knew, my other fellow creative artists were also struggling with the same. Everyone was posting, lack of creativity and things like that. So I wanted to re-spark that and re-engage that conversation. And later on, a friend of mine recommended, like in April, the group called the Breathe Group. And they were a group organized by Natalie, Breton, and Lisa. They basically organized a Facebook group that, brought together a whole bunch of people that created masks, but focused around beadwork and indigenous. So, they vetted me and they invited me to be part of the group, and it was so nice and heartwarming to kind of like be amongst other people that were experiencing the same thing, same struggles with creativity and work.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned to me this global mask you made, other than the Chinese manual mask. Those are showing the local community support to each other. But then also you have friends all over the world also kind of become your support group, that everybody was caring for one another. So that's really a very touching story. But I want to get into this particular mask. Oops, sorry, didn't think so be able to move. This one, actually, I want to thank Don for donating this particular mask to Ron. And I was particularly interested in this mask because of the design of a beautiful woman in the form of a Chinese artistic paper cards. At the Ron, we have some collection of the folk paper cards, like the one I showed on the left. And as you can see, it's been made into a sort of a takeout bag. And then Don made this mask out of this particular takeout bag. When we received the mask, which is quite large, and we noticed that there's a big oily kind of greasy stain on the mask. So we were wondering, what's the story behind this particular mask? It was this particular bag you use it for your takeout. Why you pick particularly this one?
Yeah, that is literally the mask that we take out food was packed in. The bag was we found this beautiful Chinese Canadian restaurant on our way to Barry's Bay on the route towards Barry's Bay, like along Golden Lake. So we stopped in because at the time during COVID, it was all about supporting local. And, I did everything to support local, especially Chinese Canadian restaurants that I knew were struggling, not just with business, but also like all the Asian hate that was rising. So whenever I had a chance to stop and support a Chinese Canadian restaurant, I would, spend a paycheck there kind of thing. So the mask that the ROM has with the grease stain, it literally is I came home with the takeout, and after we enjoyed the meal, I was admiring the paper design, and I've seen this design bag before, but that meal and the time we were in, during COVID, it just the beauty of it and the meaning of it changed for me. And I wanted to add value to this design because it speaks so much to like Chinese Canadian, the journey, and how you kind of hold on to your heritage and your culture.
Yes. Yeah, this is absolutely a new way to reinvent this not just the paper card, but the thing of the beautiful woman is extremely popular sort of a thing in Chinese art. You see this beautiful women almost everywhere. I found it very interesting that a lot of your work showing this sort of represent your identity, showing where your immigrant family history, the culture you grow up with, etc. But I guess the sort of identity is also about belonging. And I guess for a person like you, there's always a question for a person like you who come from a different kind of a cultural origin, reflect on how you integrate your cultural heritage and the background into the fabric of Canadian history and the society. So that's an aspect I like to maybe show the one last work to our audience. Maybe you can talk about this cultural integration, how you present that in your work. I found this particular artwork very, very interesting. This is called Cultural Camel. Let me first very briefly tell our audience what these are. They are three very most popular Chinese gods named Fu, Lu, Shou. Here is the god of Fu, means god of the happiness, Lu, god of the sort of fortune, and god of the longevity. And more traditional kind of a look of this kind of gods will look like this. And this is also from the Rang collections. And the one on the right, unfortunately, we missed one of the three gods. The god of the Lu is missing here. But see, we have the god of the Fu and god of the longevity. And here is a woodblock print, as you can see, also made in the late 19th centuries. And god of the Shou always has this feature of a bald hair and long mustache, holding a staff, and also the fruit of a peach of the longevity. And this is the missing god of the Lu, who always wear a sort of official hat, sorry. So if you look at the Don's artwork, here you have the god of the Lu with this official hat, and you can almost identify the bald head of the god of the longevity with its peach here. I understand that you actually didn't make this sculpture, but purchased them from Oriental shop, right? So this means that this type of gods, sort of sculptures are still made today. But the different thing is you actually put a spin onto it. You add color to them with this very coded Canadian patterns. So can you tell our audience more about this, and what's kind of a message you try to deliver here by combining this Chinese popular gods with the very coded Canadian patterns?
Yeah, my work often explores identity and what it means, like what belonging means. My parents, growing up within a Chinese family in a Chinese community, and then them instilling and surrounding us with all these images from our cultural heritage, like Fu, Lu, and Shu. Mm-hmm. And then leaving that kind of bubble and going to school and learning more Western colonial kind of upbringing, there was always that juxtaposition of cultures and which one had more value in your day than others. And because my parents were so busy with their lives, the older we became, the less of a focus our Chinese heritage became. So these sculptures actually remind me so much of my parents' set that we still have on the mantle, always on a mantle. So then when I came across these at the Oriental Charm next to the restaurant, there was a gift shop. These characters really spoke to me, and I wanted to do a series that kind of focused on identity and assimilation, and I wanted to ask questions like like how do you create artwork that talks about cultural, you know, assimilation or merging of identity as a Chinese Canadian. So I focused on like really popular kind of North American patterns. Obviously the camouflage represents, you know, hunting and outdoors. Buffalo check is a very like, you know, deep rooted Canadian pattern that reminds you of a lumberjack or early pioneer days. And then the Hudson Bay, you know, that's obviously a loaded pattern. So I really was trying to play with the idea of, you know, what we do as people of color, BIPOC, what are the tools we use in our daily life to kind of, you know, integrate and assimilate and be you know, in our daily lives.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I think we probably need to have some time for our audience for the questions, right? So I'm going to stop sharing the slides.
Actually, no, if you could keep the slides on just for a minute, Wen-chien, because first of all, I want to thank Don and Wen-chien for a really well-timed and also very stimulating and very personal conversation. We could listen to you all afternoon, but we do have a few audience questions. And the reason I'm asking you to keep the screen up is they're actually related to Don's artistic practice and the materials that he uses. So first, can we scroll back to the veneration for mother and father mask? So the question is, really, could we go a little bit more into detail about the material of the mask? What is so special about this paper? You may have also mentioned that you used silk screen for the mask. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, the images of my parents are silk screens that I actually often use in a lot of my work. I have the screens in my studio and I refer to them all the time. They're beautiful portraits of my mom and dad, you know, when they first met and then, you know, fell in love. So those memories always are touching to me. This piece, the fact that they both died very close to each other, almost within a year of each other. So that sense of loss made me focus on connection, my connection to them, their connection to each other, being married for like over 50 years, having 8 children. You know, my parents opened up the Shanghai and Ottawa's Chinatown, which, you know, present day is still considered Chinatown. So they were like one of the first pioneers of Chinatown. So there's so much memory and so much meaning to their relationship. And Joss money is often burnt as an offering to your ancestors in a ceremony, in a ritual. Hansan, I mentioned that earlier. And so that money is burnt and the smoke helps that money ascend to the heavens, and then they in turn can use it in the afterlife. Hansan is like, you know, based in Taoism and Buddhist philosophy. So there's a belief that, you know, that your loved ones still kind of exist in the same form, in the same personality, but in the afterlife in another form. So that connection to them, it's like communicating to them. And this was a piece that actually, I did multiple versions of this piece, And this is the only one that I connected together. And that reminded me of the second wave, the second lockdown. So there's all sorts of layers and multiple meanings to this piece. So I made these other works that eventually I'd like to, burn them as an offering in a ceremony that reaches them eventually.
Yeah, I may just add that this is a very common concept in Chinese traditional society. Even today, people believe there's an afterlife there. So in your afterlife, you also need basically whatever you need in this life. So burning the money is a way to support your parent, even they pass away. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for those thoughtful answers. Can you scroll to the slide with the takeout masks now, please? And the question is from Jane Liu. And I should mention that Jane, along with the Bishop White Committee and members Diana Horton and Philip Chung, they actually supported the acquisition of the Veneration for Mother and Father mask. So I'm so happy that Jane is with us today. So Jane wants to ask the questions regarding this mask, but also your other, the ones made with the menus. She wants to ask, what exactly is the material of these menus? And did you need to do any extra intervention or silk screening of any kind? Did you have to introduce cloth or anything like that?
The materials are the actual materials, found objects that when I would do a takeout order from a restaurant, I would initiate a conversation telling them that I'm a visual artist. Sometimes I'd have my iPhone on me and I would show them my website or other works. And often I found that the family, its generosity was just overwhelming. And once you made a connection, the stories would just pour out of them. So that, and I understand that from being a restaurateur's perspective. When I come across other restaurateurs, that sense of support is there. So these are the actual physical menus that I use in the work, and I wanted that honesty in the materials. I wanted that connection with the business, and then their stories. These objects, they're kind of imbued with all of their stories.
Were they difficult to sew, Don? Like, did you find that you were tearing a lot of them, or?
Yeah, yes, a lot of that. Yes, I love sewing with materials other than traditional fabric.
These are papers, right?
They're made of paper, aren't they?
Paper, very delicate.
And how long did one of the masks, for example, take you to make? That was a question that just popped up in the chat.
Sometimes my studio is full of projects. So I have like corners that have projects that I go back and revisit. Sometimes I can finish a piece it depends on my inspiration and time. I can finish it within hours. Sometimes it's durational and it's months. But there's so many challenges with working with these materials, not just because it's paper, but also because the nature of the landscape of Chinese Canadian restaurants is quickly disappearing. It's a generational thing. So to kind of like capture these moments and capture these stories and the products, like the physical menus from their business, it's time sensitive for me anyways.
There's a very sweet question, actually. Have you thought of creating masks related to pets? Because it's been such a, 2 years of a lot of dog and cat adoption. Just that was a very nice question from Catherine Turok.
I know it hasn't crossed my mind at all.
Uh,
I do have pets. I have a cat, Lulu, but she's safe and she's been isolated and safe. So there hasn't been a need for me to like protect her or anything like that. But I mean, you know, I have a sewing machine. I can.
I have a couple of comments that came up in the chat, and maybe Wen-chien can also chime in here. Frank Young says, the image of the lady in the Chinese takeout paper bag, is that one of the 8 immortals of Chinese Taoist folklore?
Yeah, this is hard to tell, but from the images here, you can see that she's carrying a sort of flower basket, right? So one of the 8 immortals, yes, the women does carry kind of like a flower basket, but this kind of image is also sometimes associated with the other immortals like Magu, which who is also another important female deities. Probably we can be sure that she is certain kind of a immortal, because if you look closely, her dress here is more like a feather covered instead of regular kind of fabric. That's also an indication she is immortal. Yeah, and this type of beautiful image, women images, very popular. Why so? Because they're considered auspicious and very pleasant to look at. So I'm not surprised to find them in the folk art, like a paper cards, and then now reincarnated in this kind of a takeout paper bag, right? But I understand that then Don actually went back to the restaurant and asked for another identical one, but it's already gone, right?
Yeah, that's another identifier is she's walking on she's being traveled on a cloud.
Oh,
So
yeah. Okay. Yeah, that could be. Yeah. There's a variety of a goddess kind of images they like to use.
Yeah.
The idea is, again, that this kind of a goddess to bring beneficial auspiciousness to the humankind. Yeah.
And Wen-chien, you are working on a very large project relating to
yes,
female portraits.
yes, yes.
Yes. I don't know if you want to say a minute something about that.
Well, that's one of the reasons I really was drawn into this mask. This actually was a swap. Original Don was thinking to donate us to another one, but I say, oh, I really love this one because of this association you created with the traditional art, the folk art of paper cards, and the genre of the beautiful women images. And we cannot be more thrilled when we receive the actual mask. It's really kind of a beyond our expectation. It's made of this yellowish kind of a paper, but so beautiful. It's so interesting. Yeah.
That's a good point. I should mention that Don has actually donated this mask to the Royal.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So we purchased the veneration for mother and father, but he's himself so generous that he actually donated this one to us, and it's going to contribute to Wen-chien's research, and hopefully you'll see
hopefully it will be on display in the future exhibition.
I have one last question for Dawn from the audience, and then I have one last question, and then we'll wrap up. Lisa Casper asks, are you still making masks, or have you moved on to something bigger, wilder, and more amazing? She clearly is a fan.
Well, yeah, I do still am making masks because it's still relevant to me in my life, you know, but I've also been inundated with like quite a few large projects. One of them is looking forward to next year, the Ottawa Art Gallery. I'm doing like a curatorial artist intervention in their Firestone collection. And that's for 11-month duration. So that's a really big project that's kind of taking my focus. But I love making masks because they're small kind of sculptural items that I can focus on that kind of spark my creativity. and it brings me back to like the connection with what everybody else is going through, like in the world kind of thing. And then our relationship with the pandemic, as it changes, our practice changes.
Fabulous. Okay, so Don, if I can ask you one last question before we wrap up. Having gone through all of these things, and we continue to go through a lot of challenges over the pandemic, which is feeling relentless. And now we're waiting for boosters, and now we're waiting for vaccinations for children. And many of us are still, especially in Canada, we still wear masks when we go, when we are in big crowds and indoors. Do you feel like there is a silver lining that has come out of this pandemic at all for you?
Yeah, I do. For me personally, I do. Because like prior to the pandemic, I feel like my voice as a queer Chinese Canadian artist wasn't as heard. And then during the pandemic, with all the, every community kind of the reckoning with Indigenous residential schools and the Black Lives Matter movement and the anti-Asian hate, like there's been a focus on listening to different perspectives and different voices. And that is kind of my silver lining. I feel like our voices and our stories are being heard and being valued.
Don, thank you so much. You are getting a lot of love in the chat from the people who have attended today. And hopefully this program will be available online for those who couldn't make it. I just want to thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you again for our next digital program. Details of all upcoming ROM and home online programs can be found on the museum's website and on our social media channels. Thank you once again, Wen-chien. Thank you once again, Don, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.